The mahogany-paneled boardroom of Apex Biopharma was heavy with the silence of high-stakes tension. At 54 years old, I had spent 3 decades navigating the precise, unforgiving world of chemical engineering, but this morning represented the absolute peak of my career. I stood at the front of the room, my remote clicker resting in my palm as the massive high-definition display behind me illuminated complex molecular structures. Before me sat 6 of the most influential venture capitalists in the pharmaceutical industry, led by Harrison Cole, a seasoned investor whose firm controlled billions in healthcare capital. For 3 years, I had labored 16 hours a day in isolation, developing a revolutionary targeted molecular drug stabilization matrix that promised to deliver volatile chemotherapy compounds directly to cancerous tumors without damaging surrounding healthy tissue. I adjusted my necktie and looked Harrison Cole in the eye. I was walking them through the final clinical stability metrics, explaining how our proprietary catalyst prevented compound degradation under physiological thermal stress. The investors were nodding in deep synchronization, scribbling notes, and leaning forward with unmistakable interest. The funding round on the table was valued at $80 million. A massive infusion of capital that would transition our laboratory research into global human trials. CEO Richard Hayes, a 58-year-old executive whose polished charm masked a ruthless corporate appetite, sat at the head of the table, beaming with visible satisfaction. Then the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open with a sharp, theatrical bang. Alexis Hayes, 26 years old and recently appointed as Vice President of Innovation, glided into the room. She was dressed in a pristine white designer suit that likely cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She carried a sleek silver laptop under her arm and possessed the supreme, unearned confidence of someone who had never experienced a single day of professional consequence. Richard Hayes did not frown or reprimand her for interrupting an $80 million investor pitch. Instead, his face softened into proud paternal admiration. "I am so sorry to interrupt, Raymond," Alexis said, her tone dripping with manufactured politeness that failed to hide her underlying condescension. She did not look at me. Her eyes were fixed entirely on Harrison Cole and the panel of investors. But there has been a significant change of strategic direction. My father and I have reviewed the portfolio, and we have decided to move forward with my alternative conceptual framework instead. We do not need your ideas anymore. A cold, heavy stillness settled over the room. I stood frozen beside the podium, my clicker hovering in midair. The 6 investors straightened in their leather chairs, their expressions shifting from focused enthusiasm to awkward discomfort. Before I could utter a single word, Alexis strode to the head of the table, unplugged my laptop cable without asking, and connected her own device to the master display. My 3 years of rigorous data, chemical equations, and stability charts disappeared in an instant, replaced by a flashy presentation slide adorned with colorful marketing buzzwords, vague infographics, and exaggerated market projections. Raymond's early work laid a basic foundational baseline, Alexis announced to the room, raising her voice with practiced executive flair. However, our modern strategic vision requires a far more agile and commercially viable pathway. My streamlined conceptual framework eliminates the overly cumbersome, catalytic thermal cycles, allowing us to hit the market in half the time at a fraction of the cost. I watched in stunned silence as she clicked through slides that contained high-level structural diagrams, suspiciously identical to the crude preliminary sketches I had jotted down in my personal work journals months ago, ideas I had deliberately discarded because they lacked essential chemical stability protocols. She had taken my surface-level concepts, stripped away the complex safety mechanisms, and presented them as her own brilliant breakthrough. She stepped closer to me as she transitioned to her second slide, lowering her voice so only I could hear. "Science is obsolete, Raymond. Executive presentation is what wins funding. Step aside and let real leadership work." She turned back to the investors, launching into a rehearsed monologue full of corporate jargon. To my utter astonishment, Harrison Cole and the investment panel began smiling. Within 10 minutes, Alexis concluded her pitch, and the room erupted into enthusiastic applause. Harrison Cole stood up, shaking Richard Hayes' hand and smiling at Alexis. This is precisely the kind of bold commercial efficiency we were looking for, Cole remarked. Much more dynamic than traditional lab methodology. Richard Hayes looked past me as if I were entirely invisible, wrapping his arm around his daughter's shoulders. We are thrilled to partner with you, Harrison. Apex Biopharma is stepping into a new era. I stood beside the dimmed podium, watching the management team celebrate. Nobody looked at me. Nobody thanked me for the 3 years of sweat, sacrifice, and missed family dinners that had built the foundation of the company. Slowly, methodically, I unplugged my personal hard drive from the podium dock. I reached into my coat pocket, withdrew my gold-plated 30-year engineering pin, and laid it quietly on the polished mahogany table beside my building access card. I caught Richard Hayes' eye for a brief fraction of a second as I zipped up my leather briefcase. The CEO gave me a curt, dismissive nod that signaled my career at Apex Biopharma was officially over. "Enjoy the funding," I said softly, my voice calm, steady, and devoid of anger. I turned on my heel and walked out of the boardroom, my footsteps echoing against the marble floor of the executive corridor. I passed through the lobby, stepped out into the crisp morning air, and got into my sedan. As I started the engine, my hands remained perfectly still on the steering wheel. There was no rage in my chest, only an absolute crystal-clear awareness of what was about to happen. Alexis Hayes had presented a beautiful, hollow shell. She had stolen the blueprint of a rocket without understanding how to build the engine. And 48 hours from now, when the investors demanded a live laboratory demonstration of the working compound, her grand illusion would dissolve into total, irrecoverable catastrophe. My journey to lead scientific architect had not been paved with trust fund privileges or family connections in corporate boardrooms. I grew up in a modest blue-collar neighborhood, the son of an auto mechanic who taught me that a structure is only as strong as its hidden welds. I paid my own way through State University by working night shifts at a chemical manufacturing plant, earning my advanced degree in molecular engineering through sheer grit and unwavering focus. When Richard Hayes recruited me 4 years ago to head the research department at Apex Biopharma, he promised me absolute scientific autonomy. For 3 years, I honored my end of the bargain, spending 16 hours a day in the isolation of the laboratory to solve one of modern medicine's greatest challenges: stabilizing volatile peptide chains for targeted drug delivery. However, 30 years in the engineering field had taught me a vital lesson about corporate politics. Never build your entire life's work on land owned by someone else without holding the deed. 8 months prior to the catastrophic boardroom pitch, Richard Hayes had installed his daughter Alexis as Vice President of Innovation. Fresh out of an elite European business school, Alexis knew nothing of organic chemistry or molecular bonding, but she possessed an insatiable hunger for executive credit. When she began lingering around my laboratory workstation, asking probing questions about catalytic ratios and requesting access to my raw data files, my instincts immediately raised red flags. I did not trust her, therefore I established a strict legal and technological boundary. While I performed baseline validation work using corporate equipment, I conducted the core catalyst synthesis and mathematical stabilization modeling entirely on my personal computing hardware in my home laboratory during my off-duty hours. I personally funded every third-party reagent purchase and documented every experimental breakthrough in time-stamped personal journals. Furthermore, 6 months before Alexis attempted her corporate theft, I hired an independent intellectual property attorney, Donald Wright, to file provisional patent applications. Under Title 35 United States Code Section 271 in my own name, taking advantage of statutory exemptions that protect independent, off-duty inventions. I also installed subtle internal auditing protocols on my laboratory workstation. 3 weeks before the pitch, server access logs revealed that Alexis had logged into my terminal at 10:30 at night on 4 separate occasions, downloading preliminary summary slides and copying incomplete draft files. She believed she had stolen my crown jewel. In reality, she had only downloaded a stripped-down conceptual diagram devoid of the crucial stabilizing catalytic enzyme. After walking out of the boardroom, I spent the remainder of the day at home, enjoying a quiet cup of black coffee and organizing my independent legal documentation. I turned off my mobile phone and let the world spin without me. By 8 o'clock the following morning, the inevitable storm broke over Apex Biopharma. As part of the final due diligence protocol before executing the wire transfer for the $80 million investment, Harrison Cole and his technical audit team requested an emergency live demonstration at the Apex laboratory. They wanted to witness Alexa's streamlined conceptual framework in action, verifying that the volatile compound remained stable under thermal agitation. Inside the glass-walled laboratory of Apex Biopharma, absolute panic reigned. Alexis stood beside the primary reactor core, surrounded by senior technicians who were sweating profusely under their sterile lab suits. She had instructed them to prepare the mixture using the stolen files she had uploaded to the company's server. However, because those files contained only baseline equations without my proprietary catalytic stabilization matrix, the chemical reaction destabilized almost immediately. As Harrison Cole, Eleanor Thorne, and the investment board watched through the observation window, the crystal-clear liquid inside the main reaction vessel began to cloud over. Within 45 minutes, the temperature inside the chamber spiked uncontrollably, causing the delicate peptide chains to break down completely. The reaction vessel filled with a murky, foul-smelling brown sludge that coated the interior glass. "What is the meaning of this?" Harrison Cole demanded, his voice slicing through the laboratory like a razor blade. "Your pitch deck claimed this streamlined approach yielded 99% thermal stability." Alexis turned pale, her voice cracking as she fumbled with her tablet. It must be a mechanical calibration error. The laboratory equipment is malfunctioning." She turned furiously on senior lab technician David Miller, a talented 32-year-old chemist whom I had mentored for 2 years. "You set up this batch, David. You deliberately sabotaged my protocol." David Miller stood his ground, raising his hands in disbelief. "I followed the file you uploaded to the main server to the exact letter, Alexis. I told you yesterday that this formula lacks the stabilizing enzyme catalyst, but you threatened to fire me if I questioned your science." In a desperate bid to save face in front of the investors, CEO Richard Hayes stepped into the room and pointed a finger at David. "You are terminated effective immediately for gross incompetence. Pack your things." The move backfired spectacularly. Harrison Cole folded his arms, his eyes narrowing with deep disgust. "Firing your lab technicians will not change the fact that your technology is completely non-functional, Richard. This is not an equipment error. Your entire conceptual framework is an unviable disaster." Cole turned to his investment team. "Freeze all pending funds immediately. We are conducting a full forensic review." By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the financial fallout hit the corporate offices. News of the failed laboratory demonstration leaked to industry analysts, causing Apex Biopharma's pre-market stock valuation to plummet by 18%. At 3 o'clock, my home doorbell rang. I walked calmly to the front door, checked the security camera monitor, and saw CEO Richard Hayes and CFO Howard Miller standing on my porch. The polished executive armor was entirely gone. Richard's tie was loosened, his hair was disheveled, and Howard Miller was wiping beads of cold sweat from his forehead. They were not just visiting, they were desperately banging on my door. I opened the heavy wooden front door, standing comfortably in the entryway, with my hands resting in the pockets of my trousers. The contrast between our emotional states could not have been starker. I was composed and relaxed, while Richard Hayes looked as though he had aged 10 years in 48 hours. "Raymond," Richard began, forcing a tight, strained smile that failed to conceal the desperation in his bloodshot eyes. "Thank God you are home. We need to talk inside right now." "You are standing on my private property, Richard," I replied quietly, keeping my body positioning firm in the doorway. "State your business." CFO Howard Miller stepped forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Raymond, please. There was a terrible misunderstanding in the boardroom 2 days ago. Alexis was overzealous, and Richard was overly eager to highlight family leadership. We recognize now that your presence is absolutely vital to the stability of the department." Richard nodded rapidly, swallowing hard. "We are prepared to fix this immediately. I am offering you an instant reinstatement as Chief Scientific Officer. We will double your base salary to $220,000 a year. grant you a substantial equity package, and give you full executive oversight of the lab. But you must come back to the facility right now and fix the stabilization matrix before Harrison Cole pulls the $80 million investment permanently. I looked at Richard Hayes, remembering the dismissive nod he had given me as I packed my briefcase and the arrogant mockery from his daughter. "I am afraid that is impossible, Richard," I said smoothly. "I resigned 48 hours ago after your daughter publicly informed the board and 6 major investors that my ideas were no longer needed. I accepted her professional assessment and concluded my relationship with Apex Biopharma." Richard's face flushed with a sudden, dark surge of anger. The desperate plea melted away, replaced by the tyrannical corporate authority he had relied upon for decades. "Listen to me very carefully, Raymond," Richard barked, stepping closer and raising a finger. "You built that chemical process while receiving a paycheck from my company. Every line of code, every molecular formula, and every catalytic ratio developed during your employment belongs to Apex Biopharma under your invention assignment agreement. If you are withholding the catalytic enzyme, you are committing corporate theft and violating federal trade secret laws." I smiled calmly, reaching into my coat pocket to retrieve a neatly bound folder of legal documents prepared by my attorney, Donald Wright. "I expected you might take that stance, Richard," I said, handing him the folder. "Which is why you should review those filings very carefully before you make threats you cannot back up." Richard snatched the folder, his eyes scanning the cover pages as Howard Miller leaned over his shoulder. "Under the Defend Trade Secrets Act of 2016, Title 18 United States Code. Section 1836, I explained, my voice echoing with crisp legal precision. "A trade secret is defined by proprietary development and independent economic value. The stabilization catalyst was synthesized entirely on my personal computing equipment, using my own financial resources, outside of company working hours. Furthermore, under state employment law statutory exemptions, pre-existing independent work conducted without corporate facilities remains the sole property of the inventor." Richard's hands began to tremble slightly as he read the documentation. "In addition," I continued, 6 months ago, I filed provisional patent applications under Title 35 United States Code Section 271 for the precise catalytic stabilization process. The intellectual property rights belong exclusively to me personally, not to Apex Biopharma. You have zero legal claim to the working technology." Howard Miller's face went pale. "Richard, if he filed provisional patents independently 6 months ago, our entire pitch deck was based on unassigned third-party intellectual property." "It gets worse for you, Richard," I added, maintaining a firm, authoritative tone. "My workstation at Apex Biopharma was equipped with automated security access logging. I possess verified digital audit logs and video surveillance files showing your daughter, Alexis Hayes, logging into my workstation at 10:30 at night on 4 separate occasions without authorization, downloading incomplete proprietary draft files." Richard stared at me in absolute horror. "That constitutes willful misappropriation of trade secrets and corporate espionage under federal law," I said coldly. "If you attempt to file a frivolous lawsuit against me or enforce an invalid non-compete clause, my attorney will immediately file a cross-complaint against Apex Biopharma and Alexis Hayes personally, seeking injunctive relief and punitive damages." Richard swallowed hard, his posture slumping as the absolute legal reality crashed down upon him. He realized in that exact moment that he possessed no leverage, no legal standing, and no functional product. "You planned this," Richard whispered, his voice trembling with bitterness. "You set a trap for my daughter." "I did not set a trap, Richard," I responded sharply. "I built a revolutionary medical breakthrough through 30 years of honest engineering discipline. Your daughter attempted to steal my life's work to boost her corporate standing, and you enabled her out of blind nepotism. You trapped yourselves." Before Richard could respond, his mobile phone rang loudly in his coat pocket. He pulled it out with shaking hands. The caller identification displayed the name Harrison Cole. Richard looked up at me with pleading eyes, his voice barely a whisper. "Raymond, please, what do you want?" "I want you to leave my property," I answered calmly. "And I suggest you answer your lead investor. He does not sound like a man who enjoys waiting. Without another word, I stepped back and closed the front door, locking it firmly. Through the side window, I watched Richard Hayes and Howard Miller walk slowly down my driveway, defeated, broken, and facing the total destruction of their corporate empire. At 10 o'clock the following morning, my phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. It was a direct message from Harrison Cole. "Mr. Vance, I would greatly appreciate the opportunity to meet with you privately for 30 minutes at the Metropolitan Club downtown. No corporate representatives from Apex Biopharma will be present." I replied concisely, agreeing to the meeting. I dressed in a tailored Navy suit, picked up my leather briefcase containing my independent patent documentation, and brought along a compact, portable chemical testing kit that contained verified, stable samples of the targeted molecular matrix synthesized in my home laboratory. When I arrived at the executive dining room of the Metropolitan Club, Harrison Cole was already seated at a private corner table overlooking the city skyline. Beside him sat Eleanor Thorne, senior managing partner of Thorne Capital and one of the most respected venture analysts in the sector. Harrison Cole stood up immediately as I approached, extending his hand with genuine professional respect. "Thank you for coming, Raymond. Please, sit down." "Thank you, Harrison, Eleanor," I said, placing my briefcase beside my chair and taking a seat. "I will be direct with you, Raymond," Harrison began, leaning across the white linen tablecloth. "Yesterday's laboratory demonstration at Apex Biopharma was an absolute disaster. The liquid compound decomposed into unusable waste within 45 minutes. When I confronted Richard Hayes, he attempted to blame a junior technician, but our technical audit team confirmed that the chemical formula itself was fundamentally flawed." Eleanor Thorne nodded in agreement. "Richard and Alexis presented an $80 million expansion plan based on what they claimed was a streamlined innovation. However, after reviewing internal server logs last night, our auditors discovered that the critical catalytic stabilization protocols were entirely missing from their corporate systems." "They were missing from their systems," I explained calmly, "because that technology was never corporate property." I opened my briefcase, extracted 2 bound folders, and passed them across the table to Harrison and Eleanor. "These documents contain independent audit verification, time-stamped lab records, and certified provisional patent filings under Title 35 United States Code Section 271, I said. "3 years ago, when I began developing this stabilization matrix, I recognized that Apex Biopharma lacked proper intellectual property safeguards. I conducted the core catalytic enzyme synthesis entirely on my off-duty time, using my personal financial capital and home lab infrastructure." Harrison Cole scanned the patent documentation, his eyes widening as he read the filing dates. "You filed these provisional patents 6 months ago. Under your own name?" "Exclusively under my name," I confirmed. "Furthermore, my attorney has established that my work falls strictly under statutory state exemptions protecting off-duty independent inventions. Apex Biopharma holds zero legal ownership over the working catalytic matrix." Eleanor Thorne leaned forward, studying me closely, and Alexis Hayes' pitch deck. I pulled out a secure tablet, playing a crisp video recording captured by the laboratory security system. The video clearly depicted Alexis Hayes sitting at my desk at 10:30 at night, inserting a flash drive and downloading draft summary files from my terminal. 3 weeks before the investor pitch, I stated, Alexis misappropriated incomplete draft files from my station. She assumed those high-level diagrams contained the complete process. She did not realize that without the proprietary catalytic enzyme, which exists only in my personal patent files, the reaction destabilizes under physiological heat. Harrison Cole slammed his hand onto the table, his face hardening with intense anger. "They attempted to fraud our investment group out of $80 million using stolen, incomplete draft files. It was an act of extraordinary corporate arrogance and reckless nepotism," Eleanor Thorne declared, looking at Harrison. "If we had wired that capital, we would have backed a company with zero legal title to its core asset." Harrison took a deep breath, collecting his composure. He looked at me with sharp, calculating eyes. "Raymond, you are an extraordinary engineer, but you are also clearly a shrewd strategist. What is your current operational status? 3 weeks ago, I replied calmly. Seeing the direction Apex Biopharma was heading under Richard Hayes' leadership, I incorporated my own independent firm, Vance Biotech Solutions. I hold full legal title to the stabilization patent, and I possess the exact catalytic formulation required to stabilize volatile oncology compounds. To demonstrate my point, I opened my portable testing kit, placing 2 sealed glass vials on the table. One contained a baseline peptide solution that had already degraded into cloudy sediment. The other contained my stabilized molecular matrix, perfectly clear and resilient despite thermal exposure. Harrison Cole stared at the clear vial, a slow, appreciative smile spreading across his face. "Raymond?" Harrison said, his tone voice rich with authority. "Our investment syndicate was prepared to commit $80 million to commercialize this exact technology. We do not care about Richard Hayes, and we certainly do not care about his daughter. We care about backing the master architect who actually owns and understands the science." He extended his hand across the table once more. Cole Venture Partners and Thorn Capital are prepared to redirect the entire $80 million funding commitment directly to Vance Biotech Solutions. We will offer you 60% equity retention, full voting control of the board, and absolute scientific authority. I looked at the seasoned investor, feeling 30 years of hard work, discipline, and integrity culminate in a single triumphant moment. "Harrison, Eleanor," I said, shaking his hand firmly. "We have a deal." The corporate fallout following our meeting at the Metropolitan Club was swift, decisive, and catastrophic for Apex Biopharma. Within 24 hours, Harrison Cole and Eleanor Thorne issued a joint public statement announcing that their investment syndicate had officially terminated all negotiations with Apex Biopharma due to material misrepresentation and failed technical due diligence. The news hit Wall Street like a seismic shockwave. Analysts downgraded Apex Biopharma stock immediately, causing its shares to crash by 25% in a single trading day. Panicked by the massive destruction of shareholder value, the board of directors of Apex Biopharma convened an emergency closed-door meeting. Facing looming lawsuits under Title 18 United States Code Section 1836 for corporate misrepresentation, and facing a shareholder derivative suit for breach of fiduciary duty, the board voted unanimously to terminate CEO Richard Hayes effective immediately, stripping him of his severance package. Alexis Hayes was summarily escorted from the building by security guards, her corporate career ending in absolute disgrace. Meanwhile, 3 miles down the road, a completely different story was unfolding. With the first tranche of the $80 million investment secured, I leased a state-of-the-art 20,000-square-foot laboratory facility in the city's premier technology park. The sign mounted on the glass entrance read in bold, silver lettering, "Vance Biotech Solutions." On our very first day of official operations, I stood in the bright open lobby, welcoming our newly hired engineering team. My very first hiring decisions had been to bring over the talented professionals who had been mistreated at Apex Biopharma. I personally hired back David Miller as senior laboratory director, offering him triple his previous salary and a generous equity stake in the company. I also brought over Julian Drake and 4 senior chemical technicians, creating an environment built on mutual respect, scientific rigor, and shared success. "Welcome to Vance Biotech," I said to the gathered team, my voice resonant with pride. "In this facility, there are no shortcuts, no stolen credit, and no corporate nepotism. Here, your work belongs to you, and integrity is our highest standard." The room erupted into genuine applause, and my team immediately set to work, setting up our advanced reaction chambers. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, as I sat in my spacious new corner office reviewing clinical trial schedules, my executive assistant informed me that a courier had delivered a package to the front desk. I walked out to retrieve it. It was a simple cardboard box shipped from the liquidating offices of Apex Biopharma. Inside were the remaining personal items I had left behind in my old desk drawer. A silver desk clock presented to me 20 years ago, a framed photograph of my late father, and my original leather-bound research journal. Tucked inside the journal was an envelope containing a handwritten note from Richard Hayes. His handwriting was shaky and uncharacteristically small, Raymond, the board has stripped me of everything. My reputation is destroyed, and Alexis has been blacklisted from the industry. You held every card from the start and let us destroy ourselves. Was your revenge worth the total ruin of my family's legacy? I stood by the window of my office, looking down at the thriving laboratory floor below where David Miller and Julian Drake were calibrating our primary synthesis reactor. The compound inside the chamber was crystal clear, shining brightly under the LED laboratory lights, perfectly stable, perfectly execution. I picked up a pen and wrote a brief, silent response in my mind to Richard's question. Revenge had never been my primary motivation. My goal had simply been to protect the truth, honor my craft, and ensure that 30 years of dedication were not erased by arrogant parasites. Richard Hayes and his daughter had not been ruined by my actions. They had been ruined by their own greed, dishonesty, and fundamental disrespect for hard work. At 54 years of age, I had not merely survived a corporate execution. I had built an empire of my own. I placed my father's photograph on my desk, picked up my tablet, and walked down to the lab floor to lead our first official synthesis run. The future of targeted medicine was finally in honest hands, and our work was just beginning. If this story of perseverance, legal justice, and corporate reckoning resonated with you, please press the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories. Have you ever faced corporate theft or had to stand up to an arrogant superior in your workplace? Share your experiences and thoughts in the comments below. I read and value every single response.